November 12, 1942. Richmond, California. The air tasted of salt spray and hot metal, thick with the acrid bite of welding torches that never stopped burning. At Kaiser Shipyard No. 2, a woman named Constance Bowman stood on a platform 40 feet above the ground, her leather gloves blackened from handling steel plates that arrived still warm from the cutting shed. Below her, the skeleton of a ship was taking shape with a speed that defied every law of shipbuilding she had learned in her 6 weeks of training. The keel had been laid just 4 days ago. This morning, Sunday morning, while churches across America filled with worshippers praying for their sons overseas, 3,000 workers moved across this single hull like a living organism, each performing one small task that somehow, impossibly, would result in a 10,000-ton cargo vessel by Thursday afternoon. Constance checked her watch. 9:47 in the morning. In exactly 3 days, 15 hours, and 42 minutes, this ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, would slide into San Francisco Bay, fully assembled, ready to carry 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition to some distant battlefield, where American boys were dying because they lacked exactly what this ship would deliver. The mathematical precision of it troubled her. 4 days to build what had taken 6 months just 2 years earlier. Something profound had changed in America, something that went beyond mere efficiency or innovation. Standing on that platform, watching welders shower sparks onto deck plates, while crane operators swung 50-ton sections into place with balletic precision, Constance understood that she was witnessing not just industrial production, but industrial transformation on a scale that would reshape the physics of warfare itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that would haunt military analysts for decades was already forming in rooms where Japanese and German intelligence officers studied reports they could not believe, reports they assumed must be propaganda or miscalculation. How had the Americans done this? How had a nation that built 3,000 aircraft in 1939 produced 300,000 by war's end? How had a country that launched 23 naval vessels in the entire decade of the 1930s built more ships in 1941 alone than Japan would construct during the entire war? The answer was not merely technological, it was psychological, cultural, economic, and human, in ways that defied the assumptions of every military power that had underestimated American industrial capacity. But the deeper question, the one that reveals the profound irony at the heart of this story, was this. What happens when a nation built on mass production and consumer abundance suddenly redirects that entire apparatus toward destruction? What emerges when factory workers who had been making automobiles on Monday begin assembling bombers on Tuesday? When women who had never held tools heavier than kitchen utensils start welding together the instruments of naval warfare? When the same assembly line thinking that had democratized the automobile transforms the very mathematics of global conflict? Standing on that platform, Constance Bowman could not have known that she was part of the greatest industrial mobilization in human history, one that would produce 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, arm not just American forces but British, Soviet, and Free French armies, and demonstrate a form of national power that transcended battlefield tactics or military strategy. She knew only that her shift ended at 6, that her hands ached from the vibration of the welding gun, and that somewhere in the Pacific, her brother's destroyer needed the ammunition this ship would carry. The SS Robert E. Peary would launch on time. It always did. To understand the magnitude of what America accomplished between 1941 and 1945, one must first understand the world as it existed on the morning of December 7, 1941, before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, before the transformation began. The United States in 1941 was not a military power. It was barely a military presence. The American Army ranked 18th in the world by size, smaller than Romania's, smaller than Poland's, equipped with weapons so outdated that soldiers trained with wooden rifles and trucks painted to resemble tanks. The entire American tank force consisted of 331 vehicles. 331. By contrast, Germany fielded 5,600 panzers in June 1940 when they invaded France. The American industrial base, however, was something else entirely. It was the largest in the world, producing more steel, more coal, more oil, more automobiles, more electrical power than any other nation. In 1941, American factories manufactured 3 million passenger cars, 3 million vehicles built for pleasure, for convenience, for the consumer abundance that defined American capitalism. Those same factories, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Packard, would not build a single passenger automobile between February 1942 and the end of the war. Not one. Instead, they would produce 50% of all aircraft engines, 33% of all machine guns, 80% of all tanks and tank parts, and 100% of the trucks that would carry American armies across Europe and the Pacific. But in December 1941, this transformation had not yet occurred. America was a nation asleep to its own potential, governed by men who understood production but not war, abundance but not scarcity, innovation but not urgency. The military brass requested 60,000 aircraft for 1942. Experts calculated production capacity at perhaps 40,000. President Franklin Roosevelt, in a moment that would define his wartime leadership, looked at those numbers and announced that America would build 125,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. His advisers thought he had lost his grasp on reality. German intelligence officers, when they received reports of Roosevelt's production goals, dismissed them as obvious propaganda, the desperate bluster of a weak nation trying to frighten its enemies with impossible numbers. They were wrong. By 1944, American factories produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. By war's end, American shipyards had launched more tonnage in 1941 alone than Japan built during the entire conflict. The arsenal of democracy was not propaganda. It was mathematical reality expressed through steel, aluminum, rubber, and human labor organized with a precision that warfare had never before witnessed. The Japanese understood naval warfare. They had spent decades building a fleet designed for one purpose: to defeat the American Pacific Fleet in a single, decisive battle. Their battleships were marvels of engineering. The Yamato and Musashi, completed in 1941 and 1942 respectively, were the largest, most heavily armed battleships ever constructed, carrying 18-inch guns that could hurl 3,200-pound shells 26 miles with devastating accuracy. Japan entered the war with 12 battleships, veterans of earlier conflicts, modernized and ready. Their naval strategy assumed that American industrial capacity, however vast, could not match Japanese experience, training, and tactical sophistication, quality over quantity, elite warriors over mass production. The Americans, meanwhile, were designing something different, not bigger battleships to match the Yamato, but aircraft carriers. Lots of them. The Essex-Class carrier program ordered 32 hulls. 24 would be completed. The first, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. By mid-1943, a new Essex-Class carrier entered service every 2 months. 17 saw combat before war's end. Not one was sunk by enemy action, though several sustained crippling damage from kamikaze attacks and kept fighting. The Japanese built 6 carriers after Midway. The Americans built 17 Essex-Class fleet carriers, plus scores of smaller escort carriers. The mathematics of industrial warfare had shifted. This was no longer about individual ship superiority. It was about production velocity that exceeded destruction velocity. But numbers alone do not explain what happened. The transformation required something more fundamental, a complete reimagining of how ships, aircraft, and weapons could be built. Before the war, shipbuilding was a craft. It was art as much as engineering, performed by men who had served apprenticeships lasting years, who knew the personality of hot metal and the geometry of hull stress, who could rivet plates together with a precision that made each ship unique. A Liberty ship, the standard cargo vessel America would build by the thousands, contained 250,000 individual parts. Traditional shipbuilding assembled those parts one at a time, in sequence, on a single slipway where the vessel grew gradually from keel to superstructure over months of patient labor. A medium cargo ship took 8 months to build. A battleship required 2 years. These were the timelines that every naval power accepted as immutable physical law. Riveting was the bottleneck. Each rivet hole had to be drilled, each rivet heated until it glowed cherry red, then driven through the hole and hammered flat on both sides, while still hot enough to deform. A skilled riveter, trained through 6 months of apprenticeship, could drive perhaps 500 rivets in a 10-hour shift. A single Liberty ship required 300,000 rivets. The mathematics were simple and inflexible. Months of work, thousands of man-hours, labour that could not be accelerated without sacrificing the integrity of the hull itself. Henry Kaiser looked at those numbers and saw not physical law but habit masquerading as necessity. A former road builder who had helped construct the Hoover Dam, Kaiser understood large-scale engineering but knew nothing about ships. This ignorance, it turned out, was his greatest advantage. He was not bound by the wisdom of generations of shipwrights who knew the right way to build a vessel. He saw only a problem in logistics and mass production was something America understood better than any nation on earth. Kaiser replaced rivets with welds. A person could learn to weld in 2 weeks. Welding was faster, required less physical strength, and eliminated the need for heating rivets and hammering them into place. More importantly, welding allowed prefabrication. Entire sections of a ship bow assemblies, stern sections, deck plates, bulkheads could be built separately in different parts of the shipyard, or even in different facilities entirely, then transported to the slipway and welded together like children's building blocks. What had been sequential now became parallel. While one section was being assembled on the slipway, a dozen other sections were simultaneously taking shape in fabrication sheds across the facility. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan demonstrated the concept's full potential, building B-24 Liberator bombers aircraft that contained 1,550,000 parts compared to a Ford automobile's 15,000 Willow Run, produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes at peak production, 1 bomber per hour. The plant employed 42,000 workers operating in 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The assembly line stretched for more than a mile inside a single building that covered 67 acres under one roof. Raw materials entered at one end: aluminum sheets, engines, instruments, weapons systems, tires, glass, electrical components, and 90 minutes later, a completed 4-engine bomber rolled out the other end, ready to fly to a base for crew training and combat deployment. This was not mere efficiency improvement. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of what industrial production could achieve. The Americans had taken the logic of consumer manufacturing standardization, interchangeable parts, assembly line construction, parallel processing, and applied it to weapons of war with a totality that shocked even American planners. When Roosevelt announced production goals that his own experts considered impossible, he was making a bet on American industrial culture itself, on a nation that had spent 3 decades learning to make millions of identical automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and washing machines. The Japanese had no equivalent. Their industrial base was smaller, their resources more limited, their manufacturing traditions rooted in craftsmanship rather than mass production. A Japanese aircraft factory might produce 30 planes per month. An American factory produced 30 per day. Japan's total aircraft production from 1939 to 1945, approximately 76,000 planes. American production in 1944 alone, 96,000 aircraft. In a single year, America built more planes than Japan constructed during the entire war. The mathematics of attrition had changed. It no longer mattered if Japanese pilots were better trained, if their Zeros were more maneuverable, if their tactics were superior. America could absorb losses and replace them faster than Japan could inflict damage. The transformation required people, millions of them. In 1939, American shipyards employed 40,000 workers. By 1943, Kaiser's 7 yards alone employed 200,000. The Richmond shipyards, built on tidal mudflats across the bay from San Francisco, went from empty ground in December 1940 to 4 massive facilities, launching a ship per day by mid-1943. Finding workers became the bottleneck. With 15 million men serving in uniform, American industry turned to populations previously excluded from industrial work. Women, African Americans, disabled veterans, teenagers, retirees, anyone willing to work 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. Constance Bowman arrived at Kaiser Shipyard No. 2 in August 1942, a 24-year-old schoolteacher from Yakima, Washington, who had never touched a welding torch. Her training consisted of 2 weeks in a warehouse where instructors taught basic welding technique, how to strike an arc, how to control the puddle of molten metal, how to create a bead that would hold under stress. After 14 days, she was assigned to a hull section, given a welding gun that weighed 35 pounds, and told to weld deck plates. No apprenticeship, no years of craft knowledge. Just 2 weeks of instruction and a production quota. Complete your assigned welds before the next shift, because the schedule permitted no delays. She was not unusual. 30% of Kaiser's workforce was female by 1943. Women welded, operated cranes, drove rivets when riveting was still used, inspected hulls, managed inventory, supervised work crews. The famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda posters were not aspirational fiction. They were documentary evidence of a labor force transformation unprecedented in American history. Kaiser hired wounded veterans who could work sitting down. He hired men over 65 who could not pass military physicals but could read blueprints and operate machinery. He hired anyone who would show up, work hard, and learn fast. Because the bottleneck was not steel or aluminum or rubber. America had those in abundance but human hands to assemble the components into finished weapons. The work was dangerous. Welding torches operated at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Crane loads weighing 50 tons swung overhead constantly. Workers climbed scaffolding 40 feet high in all weather, working through rain, fog, summer heat. Industrial accidents were common. Crushed fingers, burned skin, falls from heights, arc flash that could permanently damage eyesight. Kaiser responded with another innovation that would outlive the war itself. Employer-provided health care. The Kaiser Permanente medical system, now serving millions of Americans, began as field hospitals adjacent to shipyards, staffed 24 hours per day to treat injured workers and return them to production as quickly as possible. This was not altruism, it was logistics. Every worker hour lost to injury was a delay in delivery schedules that commanders in the Pacific were counting on with lives at stake. The psychological transformation was as profound as the physical one. Women who had been teachers, secretaries, housewives, suddenly found themselves performing labor previously reserved for men, earning wages that exceeded what most had ever made, experiencing independence and capability that reshaped their self-conception. African Americans found industrial work that paid better than agricultural labor or domestic service, though they still faced segregation and discrimination even inside factories nominally united in common purpose. The war was not creating equality that would require decades more struggle, but it was demonstrating possibilities that had been systematically denied, showing what people could accomplish when given opportunity and training rather than being told what they could not do. Meanwhile, in Detroit, automobile factories were undergoing their own metamorphosis. The last civilian automobile rolled off American assembly lines on February 10, 1942. From that date until war's end, not a single passenger car was manufactured. Instead, Chrysler made fuselages for Beine-Ogtiv bombers. General Motors produced airplane engines, machine guns, trucks, tanks, and the famous DUTW amphibious vehicles, the duck trucks, that would storm beaches from Normandy to the Pacific Islands. Packard manufactured Rolls-Royce engines for British aircraft. The automotive industry, which had consumed 51% of America's malleable iron, 75% of plate glass, 68% of upholstered leather, and 80% of rubber for consumer products, redirected that entire supply chain toward military production within months. The speed was possible because American industry already understood mass production. The techniques were not new. The scale was. A B-24 Liberator bomber contained 1,550,000 parts. Ford's Willow Run plant, designed specifically to build B-24 seconds, completed construction in just 19 months, and began production in September 1942. By March 1944, the plant produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes. Workers who had assembled Model T automobiles now assembled four-engine strategic bombers using the same principles: standardized components, interchangeable parts, assembly line construction, a division of labor so specific that individual workers performed single repetitive tasks requiring minimal training but producing maximum efficiency through sheer repetition. By mid-1943, the mathematics of industrial warfare had become undeniable. In the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, June 1942 to June 1945, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. During the same period, America built 17 Essex-Class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and over 100 escort carriers converted from merchant hulls. American carrier production exceeded Japanese construction by a factor of 20 to 1. This was not merely quantitative superiority. Each American carrier was larger, faster, better armored, and carried more aircraft than its Japanese counterpart. The USS Essex displaced 27,000 tons fully loaded and operated 90 aircraft. Japanese carriers built during the same period averaged 15,000 tons and carried 60 planes. The disparity extended across every category of military production. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan's total production from 1939 through 1945 was 76,000 planes. American aircraft production in a single year exceeded Japan's entire war effort. Tank production showed similar imbalance. America built 86,000 tanks during the war. Japan built approximately 6,000. Artillery production. America manufactured 193,000 artillery pieces. Japan produced 13,000. Trucks. America built 2 million military trucks. Japan built approximately 165,000. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders and frontline troops was profound and demoralizing. Japanese pilots who survived aerial combat reported facing waves of American aircraft that seemed endless. Shoot down 5 planes, and 10 more appeared. Japanese submarines targeting American supply convoys found that sinking merchant ships accomplished nothing, because replacement vessels arrived faster than submarines could sink them. In 1943, American shipyards launched ships at a rate exceeding German U-boat kill totals by 3 to 1. Every merchant ship sunk was replaced by 3 new ones before the month ended. Japanese naval officers understood intellectually that America possessed greater industrial capacity, but understanding abstractly and experiencing concretely are different cognitive processes. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the gulf between abstract knowledge and material reality. Japan launched 450 carrier aircraft in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 375 Japanese planes, 83% of the attacking force, while losing only 30 American aircraft. Japanese carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiyo were sunk. The remaining Japanese carrier force retreated with only 35 operational aircraft among them. For Japan, these losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. For America, they were statistics that would be absorbed and overcome within weeks. The pilots lost could not be easily replaced. Training carrier pilots required 2 years, but the aircraft themselves were already in production at rates that staggered comprehension. 9,000 planes per month rolled out of American factories in 1944. Japan's entire annual production was 7,000 aircraft. In 1 month, America built more planes than Japan produced in a year. Liberty ships became the symbol of American productive capacity precisely because they made the abstract concrete. A Liberty ship was 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded, and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo, 2,800 jeeps, 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition. Each ship cost approximately $2 million and required 500,000 man-hours to construct. By traditional methods, building one took 8 months. Henry Kaiser's yards reduced that to 42 days on average. The SS Robert E. Peary, built in 4 days and 15 hours, was a publicity stunt, a stunt ship or incentive ship, depending on who described it, but the stunt was grounded in reality. Average construction time for Liberty ships dropped from 197 days in early 1941 to 42 days by late 1943. This meant American shipyards could absorb losses and still expand the merchant fleet. German U-boats sank merchant shipping at devastating rates in 1942 and 1943. But by mid-1943, American construction outpaced German destruction 3-1. Every merchant ship sunk was replaced by 3 new ones within the same month. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping losses since 1939 had been completely replaced by new construction. The mathematics of attrition warfare, which Germany had successfully employed against Britain in World War I, collapsed against industrial production, operating at scales Germany could not match or counter. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing captured American logistics documents, concluded the documents must be falsified, propaganda, because the production figures listed were physically impossible based on Japan's understanding of industrial capacity. No nation could build that many ships, that many planes, that many tanks, that many trucks. The numbers had to be exaggerated tenfold. They were not. Philippine Sea. A Japanese destroyer captain named Tameichi Hara stood on his bridge watching the horizon fill with American ships. He had fought through the entire Pacific War, surviving multiple engagements, witnessing the gradual attrition of Japanese naval power from the confident fleet that struck Pearl Harbor to the desperate remnant now assembling for what commanders called the decisive battle at Leyte Gulf. Hara had read intelligence reports describing American industrial production. He had dismissed those reports as obvious exaggeration, American psychological warfare designed to demoralize Japanese fighting spirit through impossible claims. Now, watching that horizon, he understood the reports had been conservative, if anything. The American fleet assembling for the Philippines invasion included 17 fleet carriers, 18 escort carriers, 12 battleships, 9 heavy cruisers, 24 light cruisers, and 141 destroyers. Against this armada, Japan committed 4 carriers with a total of 116 aircraft, among them 9 battleships, 13 heavy cruisers, and 35 destroyers. The Japanese carriers were bait, intended to lure American carriers away from Leyte Gulf so Japanese battleships could destroy the invasion fleet. It was a plan born of desperation, because Japan no longer had the carrier aircraft or trained pilots to conduct offensive operations. The carriers were decoys, sent north to die while battleships tried to reach the landing beaches. Hara watched American aircraft swarm overhead in formations so large he stopped counting after the first 100 planes. They came in waves throughout the day: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters. Japanese anti-aircraft fire shot down some, but more always followed. Hara had been trained to believe in Japanese warrior spirit, in the superiority of Japanese tactics and Japanese determination. He still believed his sailors fought with courage Japan's enemies could not match, but courage, he now understood, meant nothing against industrial capacity operating at American scales. You could not fight numbers this large with spirit alone. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23 through 26, 1944, became the largest naval battle in history and effectively destroyed Japan's capacity to conduct fleet operations. Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, 305,452 tons of warship, representing 13% of Japan's total wartime losses in a single 4-day battle. American losses: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort. The exchange ratio was so lopsided that it ceased being battle and became massacre. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What Hara experienced in those 4 days was not merely military defeat, but the complete collapse of the worldview he had been taught to believe. Japanese naval doctrine had assumed that superior training, superior tactics, and superior warrior spirit would overcome American material advantages. The doctrine was wrong. Not partially wrong, not wrong in emphasis or degree, but fundamentally wrong in its basic premises about how modern industrial warfare functioned. American industrial capacity was not just an advantage to be overcome through determination. It was a form of power that operated by different rules, that made traditional measures of military strength, number of battleships, quality of pilots, tactical sophistication, increasingly irrelevant. Lieutenant Haruki Iki, a Japanese pilot who survived being shot down and became a prisoner of war in 1944, later described the moment his worldview collapsed. After his capture, he was transported to a POW camp aboard an American escort carrier. The carrier's hangar deck held aircraft, dozens of them, arrayed in neat rows, all identical. Iki asked an American sailor how many carriers the United States Navy operated. The sailor said 45 fleet and escort carriers, with more under construction. Iki thought the man was joking or lying. Japan had begun the war with 10 carriers and had strained its entire industrial base building 6 replacements. 45 carriers was impossible. The sailor showed Iki a magazine, Life, dated September 1944, that contained photographs of American shipyards. The images showed rows of carrier hulls under construction simultaneously, not one at a time, but dozens in parallel. Iki stared at those photographs for hours, unable to reconcile what he saw with what he had been taught about industrial production. The psychological trauma was compounded by small details. The POW camp served 3 meals daily, each containing more food than Iki had eaten in a typical day in the Japanese Navy. American guards discarded half-eaten meals into garbage bins. Americans wasted more food than Japanese soldiers received as rations. The camp provided clean clothes, hot showers, medical care, recreational facilities. Prisoners could write letters home, receive packages, attend religious services. This was not how Japan treated prisoners. Japan rarely took prisoners, preferring to kill captured enemies, and it revealed yet another assumption that proved false: that American wealth made Americans soft, that abundance created weakness rather than strength. Americans were not soft. They were simply operating with resources at scales that made scarcity irrelevant. The evidence was material, physical, undeniable. By late 1944, every Japanese soldier, sailor, and pilot who survived combat encountered proof that Japan's understanding of American capacity had been catastrophically wrong. The war ended not with Japan's surrender, but with its exhaustion. By August 1945, Japan's industrial capacity had collapsed entirely. American submarines had severed supply lines connecting the home islands to resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. 88% of Japan's merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Factories that had produced aircraft and warships now stood idle, lacking steel, aluminum, rubber, fuel. Cities were ash. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, firebombing had destroyed industrial districts and residential areas alike, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and eliminating Japan's capacity to continue manufacturing weapons even if raw materials had been available. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August simply provided the final justification for a surrender that material reality had already made inevitable. Constance Bowman returned to teaching in 1946. The Richmond shipyards closed in spring 1946 after completing their final vessel, the SS Marine Snapper. Within months, the facilities that had employed 200,000 workers stood empty. The women who had welded ships, operated cranes, driven trucks, managed logistics. Millions of them across hundreds of factories were dismissed and told to return to domestic life. Many did. Others refused. The transformation they had experienced was not reversible through government mandate or social pressure. They had discovered capabilities they had not known they possessed, earned wages that provided independence, performed labor that society had told them they could not do. Some fought to keep their factory jobs, most lost those fights. But the knowledge remained. Social restrictions on women's capabilities were conventions, not natural laws, and conventions could be challenged. African Americans who had worked in war industries faced similar dismissals, returning to segregated communities and discriminatory employment practices that the war had temporarily suspended but not eliminated. Yet they too had experienced something that could not be forgotten. Their labor had been essential. Their contributions had mattered. They had performed skilled work and proved competent despite every racist assumption to the contrary. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in wartime factories where black workers demonstrated abilities that white society had long denied they possessed. The WWII campaign victory abroad against fascism, victory at home against racism did not achieve its goals during the war, but it established a framework for the struggles that would follow in the 1950s and 60s. Henry Kaiser became one of America's most celebrated industrialists, though his shipbuilding empire dissolved after the war when government contracts ended. He moved into aluminum production, steel manufacturing, automotive engineering, founding Kaiser Frazer Automobiles, which produced innovative designs until the company folded in the 1950s. But Kaiser's greatest legacy was not ships or cars. It was Kaiser Permanente, the health maintenance organization he had established to provide medical care for shipyard workers. By demonstrating that employer-provided health insurance could work at large scale, Kaiser helped create the model that would dominate American healthcare for decades, for better and worse. The Liberty ships themselves mostly ended in scrapyards. By 1947, many were anchored in ghost fleets awaiting disposal. Some were cut apart for steel, their hulls recycled into peacetime products. Others were sunk deliberately to create artificial reefs or breakwaters. A few survived as museum ships or were sold to foreign operators who ran them for decades. The last active Liberty ship, the SS Arthur M. Huddle, was not scrapped until 2004. These vessels, built for emergency use during wartime crisis, proved more durable than their designers intended. Like much of what America produced during the war, they were meant to be disposable, but turned out to be enduring. The psychological legacy was more complex. American industrial capacity had won the war, but not cleanly, not without costs that extended beyond the dollar figures tallied in government budgets. The assembly line thinking that produced ships in 4 days and bombers in 63 minutes had also produced a casualness about destruction that troubled some who had participated in the process. Workers who built bombers knew those bombers would drop explosives on cities, killing civilians along with military targets. The efficiency they brought to production enabled strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of non-combatants in Germany and Japan. The B-29 superfortress, built with unprecedented precision and deployed with devastating effectiveness, became the delivery vehicle for atomic weapons that incinerated 2 cities in seconds. American industrial might had saved democracy and defeated fascism. It had also demonstrated that modern warfare could achieve scales of destruction that made earlier conflicts seem almost quaint by comparison. For Japan, the aftermath involved confronting the complete failure of pre-war assumptions about industrial warfare. Japanese military planners had believed that warrior spirit, superior training, and tactical excellence would overcome American material advantages. They had calculated that America lacked the will to sustain a long war, that American society was too soft, too focused on comfort and consumer goods, to endure the sacrifices necessary for victory in the Pacific. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American society was not weakened by abundance but empowered by it. The same industrial capacity that produced automobiles and refrigerators by the millions could produce tanks and aircraft with equal efficiency. The consumer culture that Japanese militarists viewed with contempt turned out to be the foundation for the most formidable military-industrial complex ever assembled. The Americans had not merely outproduced Japan, they had redefined what production meant in the context of total war. Traditional military thinking measured strength in terms of battleships and trained divisions. American production measured strength in terms of monthly output. How many tanks this month? How many planes? How many ships? The focus was not on individual unit superiority, but on replacement velocity. It did not matter if a Japanese Zero was more maneuverable than an American Hellcat, if America could replace 10 lost Hellcats before Japan could replace 1-0. It did not matter if Japanese pilots were better trained if America could train adequate pilots faster than Japan could kill them. The mathematics of attrition warfare had fundamentally changed. Post-war Japanese analysis of the Pacific War reached uncomfortable conclusions. Japan had never had any realistic chance of victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power long enough for Japan to consolidate its Pacific conquests, had instead awakened an industrial giant whose productive capacity exceeded Japan's by factors too large to overcome through any conceivable military strategy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in America and understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese leaders, reportedly said after Pearl Harbor that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Whether Yamamoto actually said these exact words remains disputed, but the sentiment accurately captured what had occurred. By war's end, informed Japanese military officers understood they had been fighting a type of war their doctrine had not prepared them for. Traditional warfare emphasized decisive battles, where superior tactics and training could achieve victory despite numerical disadvantage. Industrial warfare emphasized sustained production, where material abundance overwhelmed tactical sophistication through sheer volume. Japan had prepared to fight 19th-century wars of maneuver and decisive engagement. America had waged a 20th-century war of industrial attrition, where factories mattered more than battlefields. The American occupation of Japan, beginning in August 1945, brought direct exposure to American industrial methods. Japanese engineers toured American factories, studied American production techniques, learned American approaches to quality control and efficiency. The irony was profound. Japan's wartime enemy became its post-war teacher. American industrial practices, adapted and refined by Japanese engineers, would eventually create the economic miracle that transformed Japan from devastated war loser to global economic power by the 1980s. Toyota's production system, famous for efficiency and quality, incorporated lessons learned from studying American mass production methods. Sony, Honda, Panasonic companies that would come to symbolize Japanese industrial excellence built their success on foundations that included American techniques observed during the occupation. The Liberty ship particularly fascinated Japanese engineers. How had Americans built ships so quickly? The answer involved not just welding versus riveting, but a complete reconceptualization of manufacturing processes. Prefabrication, parallel assembly, standardization, interchangeable components, division of labor, continuous workflow. These were not individually revolutionary concepts, but their systematic application to shipbuilding represented innovation at a scale Japanese industry had not achieved during the war. Japanese post-war industrial development incorporated these lessons, applying American mass production principles to consumer electronics, automobiles, and other products with eventually devastating effectiveness in global markets. But the deeper lesson, the one that shaped Japanese post-war identity, was about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power in the modern world. Japan had learned, at enormous cost in lives and national suffering, that industrial warfare required industrial foundations. Military prowess without industrial capacity was insufficient for modern conflict. This understanding influenced post-war Japan's constitutional rejection of offensive military capability and embrace of economic development as the path to national strength and international influence. The story of American industrial mobilization during World War II raises questions that extend beyond that specific conflict into the nature of modern power itself. What does it mean that a war was won primarily through production capacity rather than battlefield prowess? What are the implications when factories matter more than generals, when assembly line workers contribute more to victory than frontline soldiers? The answers challenge romantic notions of warfare while revealing uncomfortable truths about how industrial societies wage conflict. The workers who built Liberty ships in 4 days were not warriors in any traditional sense. They were welders, crane operators, electricians, painters, civilians performing industrial labor under dangerous conditions for wages negotiated with unions. Yet their contribution to victory exceeded that of many military units. Every ship they completed carried the supplies that kept armies fighting, the ammunition that enabled offensives, the food that prevented starvation, the fuel that powered vehicles and aircraft. Without those ships, without the continuous flow of material from American factories to overseas battlefields, no amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could have achieved victory. This reality democratized warfare in ways that previous conflicts had not. A woman welding deck plates in Richmond contributed as much to defeating Japan as a Marine storming a beach in the Pacific. Both were essential, neither was sufficient alone. The psychological implications troubled some observers even during the war. There was something dehumanizing about warfare reduced to production statistics, about victory achieved through superior logistics rather than superior courage. The individual soldier became interchangeable, replaceable, a component in a vast machine optimized for efficiency rather than for heroism. American casualty rates in the Pacific were lower than Japanese casualty rates, not because American soldiers were braver or better trained, but because American logistics ensured better supplies, better equipment, better medical care, better everything. This was victory, but it was victory of a particular type: industrial, managerial, statistical. It did not fit traditional narratives of martial glory or individual heroism. Yet it was also democratic in ways traditional warfare was not. The Liberty ship did not care who wielded the welding torch. Women performed as capably as men when given training and opportunity. African Americans, Mexican Americans, workers of all backgrounds contributed equally to production outcomes. The factory floor was not egalitarian. Discrimination and prejudice persisted throughout the war, but it was more egalitarian than military hierarchies or pre-war society. Performance mattered, output mattered. The ships had to be completed on schedule, regardless of who completed them. This created opportunities for populations previously excluded from industrial work and demonstrated capabilities that social conventions had denied. The environmental and human costs of industrial mobilization are part of the story that wartime propaganda did not emphasize. Factories consumed enormous quantities of natural resources extracted at rates that devastated landscapes. Workers died in industrial accidents at rates that would be considered unacceptable in peacetime. Air and water pollution from wartime industries damaged ecosystems and human health in ways not fully recognized until decades later. The Liberty ship construction, for all its impressive speed, involved dangerous working conditions that killed and injured thousands. Welding torches, falling steel plates, toxic fumes, long hours without adequate rest. These were the costs of production efficiency that statistics about ships per month did not capture. The atomic bomb represents the ultimate expression of industrial warfare's logic. The Manhattan Project was primarily an industrial undertaking. Massive facilities built in secret locations, employing thousands of workers who did not know what they were building, producing fissile material through processes that required industrial-scale resources. The scientific brilliance that designed the weapons was necessary, but not sufficient. What made atomic weapons possible was American industrial capacity to construct production facilities that could generate weapons-grade plutonium and highly enriched uranium in quantities sufficient for bomb construction. The bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki were products of industrial processes, as much as scientific discovery. This fact should disturb us. It demonstrates that industrial capacity, the same capacity that produced consumer goods and raised living standards, could be redirected toward destruction with efficiency that made previous weapons seem primitive by comparison. Standing on a platform above a shipyard floor, watching welders assemble a Liberty ship section by section, one confronts the central paradox of modern power. The ability to produce abundance is also the ability to produce destruction. The assembly lines that made automobiles accessible to millions could make bombers accessible to air forces. The factories that raised living standards could also level cities. American industrial victory in World War II demonstrated both the power and the peril of industrial civilization operating at maximum capacity. It showed what humans could build when necessity demanded and resources allowed. It also showed what humans could destroy when the same capabilities were directed toward violence. The war ended 79 years ago. The workers who built those ships, who welded those bombers, who operated those factories most have passed. The Liberty ships rusted into scrap decades ago. The factories converted back to peacetime production or closed entirely. But the questions remain. What does it mean to Cleese's prize? Live in a civilization capable of such production, such destruction, such transformation? What are our responsibilities as inheritors of industrial capacity that can be directed toward either creation or annihilation? The story of how America built Liberty ships in 4 days is not just history, it is warning and possibility, demonstrating both what humans can achieve and what we must guard against achieving. The choice, as always, remains ours. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.